example, we've just seen observation as one of the methods for data collection or from primary sources. Let us now look at two other methods of data collection. One is through interview and one is through questionnaire. Interview and questionnaire are basically thought to be same by most of the people, but they have 95% of similarity between these two kinds of data collection methods, but only 5% differences between these two data collection method. So let us look at what is interview, how can we collect data from interview method, and what is questionnaire and how can we collect data from the questionnaire method. So this video presentation will look at what are these two kinds of methods, advantages and disadvantages will follow, and the next video presentation will look at how to construct a very effective questionnaire. So let us look at interview and questionnaire. Interview is basically a face-to-face interaction between two people. So these days we use telephone to interact between two people, to ask information from one person over the telephone. That can also be considered as interview. These days we use audio tape to record some other person's perspective or perception. That's also called as interview. These days people also use video cameras to record. That's also an interview. So basically an interview is when it involves an interviewer reading questions to respondents and recording their answers. So it's not the respondents that will record the answers that they just told. It's the interviewer that has to record the respondent's response or respondent's answer. So please keep in mind this sentence which I just told right now. Again, that was being told by Monet et al. If we just look at a work by Burns in 1997, he said that interview is a verbal interchange, often face-to-face, through telephone, may be used in which an interviewer tries to elicit information, beliefs or opinions from another person. So basically any person-to-person interaction either can be face-to-face or either can be like over the phone, and again need not again from individual to individual or one-to-one, but it can also be between the groups, as long as there is an interchange of opinions, as long as the respondents group responds the answers and responses those data that we need for a specific purpose in our mind. That is known as interview. And in the interview, the good thing is that the researcher has freedom to construct their own format and content. But again, interview has a structured interview and unstructured interview again. In a structured interview, though they have a freedom to construct the questions, but that question has to be constructed before the interview has actually taken place. But in case of unstructured interview, the questions are loosely constructed before asking to the respondents, and interviewer in meantime, when they are asking, if certain questions come out or pop out in the mind, they ask spontaneously. So that's the difference between structured and unstructured interview. Basically, an interviewer, though even if it is structured or unstructured, an interviewer should have a list of questions in their mind or list of questions in their hand. That question can either be close-ended or open-ended, which we'll be again looking at it in next video presentation. It can either be open-ended, meaning you do not have a very close patterned answer. You can have lots of answers. You can have varieties of and diversity of answers in open-ended questions. So it can either be open-ended or close-ended questions. And this list of questions has to be with the interviewer, and this interviewer goes to respondents and asks from this list. So this list is called as interview schedule. So interview schedule now can be an instrument that will guide a method of data collection in interview. So getting that interview schedule, then the person will ask to the respondents and collect the data. If a person really sticks his interview questions to the interview schedule, if the questions are really predetermined and if he has to be really structured, then that's known as a structured interview. But if the person feels that, oh, interview schedule is just a guide for me, I need to ask around that context, but as and when questions are popping out, if he or she has got the freedom to ask, if he or she has the flexibility to ask more questions, gather more data, go into more in-depth questioning, then that's known as unstructured interview. Unstructured interview is most commonly used in qualitative research, while structured interview is mostly used in quantitative research. But however, like I said, interview is a very versatile method of data collection and is one of the most commonly used data collection methods, especially in qualitative and social sciences. But however, it can be used for both qualitative as well as quantitative research. So if you're looking at quantitative, then the kind of answers that you want to record should be in categorical responses. But if you want that research to be in qualitative, then the kind of responses that you want to record, it should be in the form of descriptive or verbatim. Verbatim is the exact words that are being said during the interview by the respondents. You jot down those exact words, and those are basically verbatim. Unstructured interview, like I said, basically there is no written, standardized, predetermined structure in terms of four things. One is the structure. There's no rigid structure. You can ask like questions starting from why did you choose to become a farmer, or why did you choose to become a biologist? And the third question is what's your name? So like the structure is not that good, because a structured interview can be starting from what's your name, what's your age, where are you from, and why did you choose to become a biologist. But unstructured interview will not have a very good structure. It will have a flexible structure, and if you look at the content again, it's not based on the theme wise. It can be up and down, shuffled. And if you look at the questions, again, the questions are very flexible. The questions that you have in the interview schedule need not be exactly reflected or exactly asked during the unstructured interview. And the wording can be, again, diverted. Wording can be used through your own convenience, and wording can be changed during the interview. So that's the freedom of the unstructured interview. But in case of structured interview, which is mostly used for quantitative research, in case of structure, it is very rigid structure. You have to ask names, age, why have you become biologist, and that kind of structure, that kind of flow is very rigid in structured interview. If you look at the content, again, the content is very good in the flow, again, well-structured content. If you look at the questions, the exact questions that are being reflected in the interview schedule has to be there in the questions that when you are doing with the structured interview. And if you look at the wording, the exact wording has to be repeated during the interview time. So that's when you do not need any interview skills if you want to conduct a structured interview, because all the rigid structured and words are being reflected in the interview schedule, and you do not have to worry about getting yourself flexible, about using other questions, about using another words. you just have to read exactly those questions. You just have to follow that structure. So that's the beauty, again, I must say, about the structured interview, that you do not need any interviewing skills. And another good thing is that if you have got lots of enumerators or lots of researchers that are assisting you, for example, you want to employ for a dissertation around 10 researchers, a structured interview can help you to employ all these 10 researchers, because they just have to exactly ask through the structure, through the content, questions and wording that's being reflected in your interview schedule. So you can then compare the data that's been collected from all these people, because the way they've asked is same, the way of the respondents they have given the answers are recorded in the same fashion. So you can compare. And like I said towards the beginning of this slide, interview schedule is a tool or instrument, while interview is method of data collection. So interview schedule is an instrument, and interviewing is a method of data collection. So like I said, unstructured interview is most commonly used a method of data collection for qualitative research. And for unstructured interview, you can again have interaction between one-to-one or one to the groups, and you can choose to have even groups in your interview. So let us look at different methods under unstructured interview. So in-depth interview is one form of method that you can apply to have an unstructured interview. In-depth interview is repeated face-to-face encounters between researcher and IFMINT, mainly to get IFMINT's perspective on their lives, experience, situation, all. So basically, you are repeatedly asking different questions to the respondents to get in-depth knowledge about your research objectives. So when you're asking in-depth questions, you are asking repeated questions which are not exactly structured in the interview schedule. So that's one of the method of unstructured interview. So lots of advantage, because you tend to know lots of things about the respondent's perspective, and you tend to get lots of data about your research objectives. The second one is focus group interviews. It's exactly same with the in-depth interview, just that this time you're not looking at one-to-one interview, but you're looking at group as your respondents. So you're asking the groups, and these groups are basically giving us in-depth knowledge about the objective that we are trying to look at. And that's the difference between the focus group interview and in-depth interview, just the inclusion of groups in case of a focus group interview. Then we have got narratives. Narrative is again exactly same with the narrative recording that we have seen in observation. It has no predetermined content. The basic thing that narrative has is that you just have to listen passively from the respondents. So you just have to ask one question, and the respondents will just be saying their views and perception, and you just have to note down continuously. So that's narrative. And your role as a researcher has to sometime encourage the person who is speaking with words like yeah, you're saying right, so right, yes, yes, yeah. You need to encourage the respondents to say more narration, so that you can record more. So that's again an unstructured, because encouragement such like these words are not reflected in your interview schedules, and sometimes out of narration people may forget some things, and again you may want to remind them. So that kind of things, that kind of active pushing to the respondents may happen sometimes, but most of the time, researcher will listen passively. But sometimes, if respondents are quite bored of speaking so much, then you need to actively again encourage them through these kind of words. Then at last, whatever the narrative session has come to the conclusion, write all the narrative observation, narrative interviews data. Then go back to go back to the respondents and try to check the accuracy whether they have said is accurately noted down in your data collection forms. The last one is oral history. The difference between oral history and narratives are oral histories are more oriented towards history, social and cultural events, while narratives are more oriented towards personal perspective. So whatever things are being covered, that covers around histories or social or cultural events. That's the domain of oral history. So rest of the things are same with the narratives. The way you ask questions, the way you listen to them is same. Just that the kind of subject or field that the respondents are going to talk is different. So personal perspective is narratives, and history, social or cultural events or phenomena talked by the respondents are the domain of oral histories. So that's on with the interview. The advantages and disadvantages of the interviews are more appropriate for complex situations. So if it is very complex and an interviewer has to be there, a researcher has to be there to grasp all the complex situation and note down, then that's when interview is very appropriate. If you want to collect very in-depth information about something else, and if you're really interested about something else, which if a questionnaire is given to respondents, they may or may not write it very in-depthly about the complex situation and all. But interview is something else that you just have to ask. Respondents just have to write it down or write it down. You can write it down on behalf of respondents, or respondents just have to speak freely, and the in-depth or complex situation can be really handled properly. Information can be supplemented because it's an interview and people can really talk different things. It can be supplemented, and again, if the respondents are not very clear, you can always supplement with the information. If the questions are not clear, you can always clarify the question. Questions can be explained again. Interviewing has a wider application. So while interviewing, you can even get so many data that you cannot get just from questionnaire. So if I just tell one of the secrets of questionnaire, questionnaire is when there's no person to guide or ask the respondents to write that way or explain the questions to respondents. Questionnaire, respondents are the ones to read themselves and write the answers on the paper, on the questions. So in case of interviewer is there, and interviewer is also there to record the respondents' answers. So recording and asking is both done by the researcher in case of interviewer, but in case of questionnaire, recording and reading is both done by the respondent. So there's no other application, and even if people have doubts, they do not have anyone to clarify their doubts with. The disadvantage of interview is that it consumes lots of time because you do not know, people may give answers in a very short period of time, good answers in a short period of time, and it's quite consuming and expensive because in interview, researchers have to go personally to the respondent's place, so that can be again expensive. Again, the quality of data really depends on the kind of interactions that has been taking place between interviewer and the respondents. The quality of the interviewer, if the interviewer is not very flexible, if the interviewer is a beginner, he or she may be having a tough time to get a very good quality data. Again, quality data really is being determined by determined when lots of interviews are being employed to collect the data. Lots of interviews means lots of data to be compared. Again, that's again a disadvantage. Sometimes researchers may introduce his or her bias because in interviews, researchers are the ones to ask as well as the researchers are the ones to record the observation. So his or her bias may be introduced. So that's on with the interview. We'll be continuing with the questionnaire.